A small town in Austria. A family house on a residential street. A young woman is dragged into a specially built cellar, chained to the wall and raped. There she remained for 24 years.
I went to see this dungeon, this prison, for myself once. I went through it and was very glad to be able to leave.
In that dark, airless space, Elisabeth Fritzl had 7 children. Her tormentor, her own father, Joseph Fritzl.
If I could decide what would happen to him, I would throw him into the same hole that Elisabeth and the children were in.
For 2 decades, he managed to fool everyone.
Nobody in this street noticed anything at all.
Until a few weeks ago, when the cellar gave up its secrets.
Intelligent, a strategist, an almost perfect criminal of the worst kind.
He turned the family home into a house of horrors. How did he do it? And how did he get away with it for 24 years? April the 19th, Saturday morning in Amstetten, a small town 70 miles from Vienna. At 7 a.m, a man called the local ambulance control, telling them that a young woman, Kirsten Fritzl, was seriously ill. An ambulance and crew were dispatched to number 40 Eibstrasse, the home of Joseph Fritzl. At the local hospital, it had been a quiet morning. All that was about to change with the arrival of the young woman, whose symptoms at first confounded medical staff.
She was in a state between life and death, and is, to this day.
The young woman was unconscious when she arrived. She had also lost many of her teeth. Later that morning, Joseph Fritzl, a man describing himself as her grandfather, turned up, saying that the girl's mother had run off many years before to join a sect. He'd brought a note from her addressed to doctors.
Please help her. Kirsten is very scared of strangers. She has never been in a hospital before. I've asked my father for help, because he is the only person she knows.
The man who claimed to be this young woman's grandfather said that this was the 4th time his daughter, who had disappeared, had abandoned a child with him. We said to ourselves, it must finally be possible to find this woman. And that's not the hospital's job, it's a job for the police.
Das ist nicht Aufgabe des Spitals, das ist Aufgabe der Polizei.
At first, the authorities concentrated on finding the girl's mother. They wanted to question her about what they thought might be criminal neglect.
All the schools were written to, the central registry database was searched, inquiries were made at the Social Security Office. Every avenue was explored. There wasn't a shred of information about Elizabeth.
On April the 21st, still baffled both by Kirsten's illness and unable to trace her mother, Elisabeth Fritzl, doctors broadcast an appeal.
What do you hope to achieve through our interview?
I would like the mother to contact us. We'll treat the contact with high discretion and will probably get a step further in our diagnosis and treatment.
Thus, it came about that a television appeal was launched because the doctor couldn't make sense of the clinical picture. And that can be explained because Kirsten had severe vitamin D deficiency.
Having failed to find Kirsten's mother, police changed tack. They went back to the family home and started taking DNA samples from the Fritzls, including the children who had previously been abandoned by their mother.
We wanted to have everyone's DNA samples in order to trace a possible father or fathers. We always thought that a woman with so many children may have had more than one partner. One of them might have had a criminal record. Herr Fritzl didn't have time to give a DNA sample and kept postponing it because he had so much to do.
On April the 26th, a week after Kirsten had first been admitted to hospital, and with her condition worsening, Joseph Fritzl led Elizabeth and 2 more children into the house. He explained to his wife that after 24 years away, Elizabeth had heard the appeals and returned from the cult. She was anxious to see her seriously ill daughter.
Nach meiner Erinnerung sind sie sogar zweimal zum Spital gefahren.
As far as I can remember, they even went to the hospital twice because the main doctor wasn't there. When they got there later on, the police had already heard they were coming.
Dass die nun kommen werden.
Tipped off, the police were ready and waiting. It was Elizabeth they wanted to question.
The questioning focused on this woman, where she'd actually been and why she'd neglected her children like that.
It wasn't all that easy for the police because Elizabeth didn't want to talk.
But as the night wore on, the truth started to emerge.
It was quite late, around midnight, that she revealed that she hadn't abandoned her children, but had been incarcerated for 24 years.
Quite unexpectedly, police found themselves listening to an incredible story of kidnap, incarceration, and rape. In the Austrian town of Amstetten, a mother suspected of criminal neglect was being questioned by police. She told them she had a story to tell, but only if she never had to see her father again. What Elizabeth Fritzl had to say would shock the world.
She was given this assurance, and then, without a break, in a mere 2 hours, she gave an account of the 24 years she spent in the cellar. Well, it still sends shivers down my spine.
This first detective was presented with a strange picture. He looked at this woman, at her physical appearance. I don't want to go into too much detail, but looking at this woman, you could believe that she'd been imprisoned for many, many years.
The full horror began emerging of the dark secrets buried beneath number 40 Eibstrasse. The 24 years of Elizabeth Fritzl's life underground covered just a few sheets of paper, but its impact was devastating.
Für mich persönlich war es ein Erlebnis und insbesondere auch deshalb.
For me, personally, it was an experience, especially because the perpetrator telephoned me just 24 hours before the crime was discovered, and he thanked me profusely for, during the week that Kirsten was in hospital, assigning a crisis intervention team to support the family.
She told police that her own father had imprisoned her since the age of 18 in a purpose-built cellar. He'd raped her repeatedly, and she'd given birth to 7 children. On April the 27th, the police went to Joseph Fritzl's house. The front set on an ordinary street, the back set amongst leafy suburban gardens. And sure enough, the full horror was revealed. From information given to us by the police, we've recreated the living conditions she experienced for nearly a quarter of a century. Fritzl had built a perfectly concealed bunker in which to imprison his own daughter and their children. Down the cellar stairs and through a warren of rooms, there were 8 locked doors before reaching the living area. The final door was concealed behind a shelving unit. There was no natural light and little air. Inside their tiny prison there was a kitchen, a bathroom and a living area. And beyond this, 2 bedrooms.
Ich habe einmal selbst dieses Kellerverlies, dieses Gefängnis besucht und bin durchgegangen.
I went to see this dungeon, this prison for myself once. I went through it and was very glad to be able to leave. The environment in this room, where the ceilings were kept very low, around 6 foot, the highest point, the environment was anything but pleasant, because everyday living, personal hygiene, etc., must have kept the level of humidity high. If we all sat down and attempted to capture 30 years in a few lines, or a brief report, or even in a slightly longer documentary, we wouldn't succeed. Because I believe that in those 24 years, life must have felt as if it lasted 10 times as long as real time.
All around number 40, Joseph Fritzl had created a natural barricade, and his nearest neighbours were 3 gardens away. Immediately next door, the old lady had moved into care. Next to her, the couple spent their weeks in Vienna, and the 3rd house along was home to Herbert and Regina Pence.
Ja, was soll man hier merken? Alle Gärten sind offen und beim Herrn Fritzl ist alles verdeckt.
Well, what are you meant to spot round here? All the gardens are open, while Herr Fritzl's is all concealed, built up, and the few open spaces are covered by trees and bushes. You can't see anything. The neighbour wanted to prune the hedge last year, but Herr Fritzl said no, leave it. And if someone doesn't want people seeing into their garden, you have to accept it. Other than that, you can't see anything.
Dann muss man es akzeptieren. Und sonst sieht man nichts.
People speak of a family who kept themselves to themselves.
Aber Familie Fritzl bei irgendwelche Gartenfeste, wie man es früher.
The Fritzl family never came to any of the garden parties we used to have around here. They never came. So in the end, basically, people stopped inviting them, because everyone knew that the Fritzls would never come to any kind of party.
Kommen sowieso nicht zu irgendeinem Fest.
Joseph Fritzl had been a successful engineer, and DIY was a natural hobby for him.
Herr Fritzl war da selber immer fleißig. Wir haben da oft die Mischmaschine laufen hören. Herr Fritzl hat weitgehend.
Herr Fritzl was always very hard-working. We often heard the noise of the cement mixer. I think that Herr Fritzl did most of the building work himself. We thought that he was adding on an extra room to rent out, or something like that.
Natürlich mitgekriegt.
According to the police, Fritzl was for many years planning a whole underground complex ready to imprison his daughter. His cover? He was building an extension to the family home in order to take in tenants.
Wir wissen heute ganz genau, dass in diesem Haus ein Teil von dem alten Keller sozusagen.
Today we know with certainty that part of the old cellar in the old house was kept back as a reserve, so to speak, and that this new house suddenly gained a small space of 30 to 35 square meters without anyone noticing. We're now proceeding on the assumption that he'd already settled upon the plan to build his own personal Reich as early as 1978 and to start a relationship with his pretty daughter Elizabeth in the cellar.
Im Keller eine Beziehung zu beginnen.
Joseph Fritzl has a history of violent sexual abuse. Recorded on microfiche in the archives are reports from 1967 of his confession to the rape of a 24-year-old woman at knife point. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison.
We knew nothing, and I can't investigate matters of which I know nothing. In Austrian law, there's a statute of limitations.
This statute within Austrian law means all record of the rape conviction was scrubbed after 10 years. His criminal past had been erased. In the years that followed, Joseph Fritzl presented himself as the strong family man in this devoutly Catholic country. His favourite daughter Elizabeth was the fourth child of 7 from his marriage to Rosemary. There were 5 girls and 2 boys. The father ruled the roost.
Ja, ich hab schon gehört in der Nachbarschaft, dass Herr Fritzl so seinen...
I did hear talk amongst the neighbours that Herr Fritzl was very firm with his children and that absolute obedience to Herr Fritzl prevailed. His wife, too, was very submissive towards him. We all knew it. He was very domineering with his family.
Sehr hörig war Herrn Fritzl gegenüber. Das hat man gewusst. So seiner eigenen Familie war herrisch.
He was very strict.
He was strict. People discussed it and knew about it.
According to those who knew her during school days, Elizabeth found the atmosphere at home oppressive. One of her closest friends at secondary school was Christa Woldrich. She speaks of a teenager who was reserved when speaking about life outside the classroom.
I did get the impression, though, that she felt more comfortable at school than at home, and that sometimes she went quiet when it was time to go home again. It was the same for both of us. It was like a silence descending.
Andreas Krutzik was Elizabeth's first serious boyfriend.
Sie hat mir halt viel anvertraut.
She really confided in me. I knew that she was under pressure from her parents and that she ran away from home when she was 14 or 15 and that she was closer to some of her other siblings.
Oder dass sie mehr Beziehung zu ihren anderen.
There was a trusted sister whom she stayed with often.
Der Schwester Vertrauen, was ja öfters war.
Before she disappeared in August 1984, Elizabeth had tried to run away to Vienna on at least one previous occasion. She's told police that her father's abuse had started when she was just 11. She'd kept it secret.
Der Missbrauch mit 11 Jahren, da habe ich die letzte Zeit auch viel nachgedacht.
The abuse at 11 years. I've thought about it a lot recently, whether I noticed anything back when we were at school. Now it's easier to understand why she didn't talk about boys or about sex.
Und zu verstehen, warum sie vielleicht nicht von Jungs gesprochen hat oder nicht über Sex.
Now, with hindsight, I understand why she didn't talk about certain things, or why she was distant and quiet. But we didn't realize it then. You just think, oh, you're having a bad day.
Was uns als Jugendlichen nicht so wirklich aufgefallen ist, man kann schon sagen, oh, hast du heute einen schlechten Tag.
Fritzl has told investigators that his decision to incarcerate his daughter was to rescue her from what he described as persons of questionable moral standards, and that ever since she started puberty, Elizabeth had ceased to obey his rules.
Apparently, Elizabeth had already caused trouble before. She had disappeared once before and then turned up again. But if there are 7 children, one of them's bound to be trouble. You just have to accept these things happen. It doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong as a parent.
Da hat man nichts falsch gemacht.
In planning Elizabeth's disappearance, Fritzl seems to have been meticulous. He was known to be highly organised, a quality appreciated by those with whom he did business. The family ran a summer guest house in the mountains and rented land from Anton Graf.
War einfach die Beziehung, die Geschäftsbeziehung, die
We had a business relationship. He was correct.
Das Wort, auf das man sich verlassen konnte.
If he gave you his word, you could count on it.
Was ich, wenn ein Werkzeug ausgeliehen
If he borrowed a tool and said he would return it 2 days later, then 2 days later it was back.
Das heißt, das, was gesagt
What he said he did, you could always count on it.
Darauf hat man sich verlassen können.
Anton Graf saw the Fritzls every summer and had known Elizabeth throughout her childhood. So when she went missing, Joseph was sure to let him know all about it.
Irgendwann ist gekommen und hat gemeint.
And then one day he came to see us in a right old state, and he told us, Lizzie won't be coming home. She's involved in a sect and has disappeared.
What her father has said is not true at all, in no way whatsoever. That she went off the rails, that she took drugs, that she joined a sect. It's not true at all. She wasn't the type to be influenced by a sect. She knew exactly what she did and what she wanted to do.
To reinforce the idea that his daughter had disappeared to join a sect, Joseph Fritzl began an elaborate deception which lasted over 2 decades. To stop too many probing questions, he even started to manufacture evidence.
And a bit later on, I don't remember exactly when, he told us that a letter had arrived. The letter said that it was pointless to search for her because she was deeply involved with the sect and that she was so happy there that she was definitely not coming home.
Elizabeth was gone for 24 years. Since her release, Elizabeth has told police her father drugged her, dragged her to the cellar and chained her to the wall. For the first 4 years of her incarceration, she was alone. According to her own account, the only visitor she had was her captor, who raped her every few days. It seems her father's web of lies had worked. No one came looking for Elizabeth, not her mother, nor her friends, nor the police.
Das ist ein Vorgang, den die Polizei immer wieder beobachtet, den man auch als Privatmensch kennt, denn irgendwann...
This is something the police see time and time again. And as we all know, every child leaves the family home at some point. Then her 19th birthday arrived. And the Austrian police aren't allowed to search for missing persons over the age of 19, because from this age onwards an Austrian citizen can go anywhere in the world they want to.
Aufhalten auf dieser Welt, wo immer man möchte.
We were a couple. We wrote to each other. We saw each other. But all of a sudden all contact ended, and when I called I was palmed off. It was over, and I didn't hear from her again.
Elizabeth Fritzl had simply vanished. No one took notice of the many clues that could have saved her. Underneath number 40 Ibstrasse, a father had imprisoned his daughter Elizabeth, tied her up, and used her as his sex slave. After 4 years alone, the next stage of her ordeal began, having her father's children. In 1988, Kirsten was born, delivered in the cellar. Elizabeth was just 22.
Wenn man If we want to discuss when things deteriorated for Elizabeth, then certainly there was the moment when she realized that she was pregnant for the first time, and then the worry throughout the pregnancy whether her child would be healthy, and the births themselves would have taken their toll, especially given there was no help on hand, like a midwife or a doctor.
Parallels have been drawn with another Austrian case, the kidnap of Natascha Kampusch. She was held for 8 years in a cellar from the age of 10 before escaping. Like her, Elizabeth would have had to reach a compromise with her captor to survive.
Wir müssen einmal feststellen, dass sie mit 18 Jahren
Since she was taken prisoner at the age of 18 and kept imprisoned, she must have been extremely scared. The question is, how did she cope with this fear? And at what point was her will broken? Because that's something we would expect to happen. And then you see something called Stockholm Syndrome, which is when the victim becomes resigned to their abuse.
Escaping from her dungeon with its 8 locked doors was always going to be difficult, but with pregnancy it seems she might have simply given up.
Es gab eine Veränderung.
There was a change. She said herself that even before she was incarcerated, she'd been abused by her father, and after being taken prisoner, had endured brutal physical violence in some shape or form. And then she told us that this had lessened.
In total, Elizabeth was to have 7 of her father's children. Michael died soon after birth, and the body was incinerated by Fritzl at the house. 3 others, Felix, now 5, Stefan, now 18, and Kirsten, now 19, led a life in captivity with their mother. But Fritzl selected the middle 3 children for a life of freedom upstairs. Alexander, now 12, Monica, 14, and Lisa, 15.
Warum dieser Mann gerade 3 Kinder mittendrin geboren nach oben nimmt?
Why this man took these 3 middle children upstairs? We'll probably never get a final clear answer. You can imagine that it was getting a bit crowded. You mustn't forget, the more prisoners in the cellar, the more complicated it became to look after them.
Taking them upstairs posed its own problems. How to explain the arrival of the babies? His solution was simple. Elizabeth was a bad mother who had abandoned her children. A pattern was established. In the middle of the night, a baby would be left on the Fritzl's doorstep with a note. Read now in the knowledge that her father was forcing her to give up her own children, Elizabeth's words are heartbreaking.
I'm really sorry that I have to turn to you again. I hope Lisa is doing well. She must have grown a bit by now. Monica is now 9.5 months old. She was breastfed for 7.5 months. She now eats almost anything, but she still likes the bottle best. The hole at the teat has to be a little bigger for her.
When the second baby was abandoned, the Austrian press started to take an interest. Mark Perry was the journalist covering the case.
1994, the first story, just after Christmas. What sort of a mother must she be? Bereits zum 2. Mal legt eine junge Frau ihr Baby vor der Wohnungstür ihrer Eltern in Amstettenweg. That's the second time she put the baby in front of the door of her grandchildren. How bad must she be? And then I heard Mr. Fritzl quoting him, our daughter has been vanishing since 1984. We think she's in the hands of some religious group, and in fact she was in his hands.
Even social services bought Fritzl's story.
If, as people assumed and her father kept claiming, Elizabeth was living with the sect, it wouldn't have been difficult at all for a member of the sect to give Elizabeth a lift at night and for her to leave the baby on the doorstep at a time when she wouldn't have been seen.
And Fritzl's closest neighbours believed his story too.
People said that it was irresponsible. What a bad mother Elizabeth was just to leave the children on the doorstep. Frau Fritzl already had 7 children, and now she had to bring up grandchildren as well. Terrible.
Over the 24 years Elizabeth was in captivity, there were over 100 tenants renting rooms in the Fritzl house, right above her prison.
In hindsight, you can always claim that you heard something, like knocking, but that simply isn't the case. I can't recall ever hearing knocking or anything at all. And if I'd heard something, what could I have done? It could have been children playing. You don't know.
After the first child was abandoned in 1992, social services paid at least 20 visits to the house. With Fritzl's rape conviction erased from his records, they had no reason to be overly concerned. In fact, social workers often left impressed by his wife Rosemary and her concern for the abandoned grandchildren.
Die Großmutter hat sich in rührender Weise die Kinder gekümmert, die Lisa, die Monika und den Alexander.
The grandmother took loving care of the children, Lisa, Monica and Alexander. These 3 children were very well brought up. They were doing very well at school. They are integrated in the community. And the notes in the records about all the meetings with the grandmother, Frau Fritzl, suggest that the atmosphere was normal.
There was sympathy for the elderly couple who had suddenly acquired a new young family.
Und es wurde lediglich das erste Kind, die Lisa, adoptiert.
Only the first child, Lisa, was adopted. The other 2 were officially raised as foster children. This option was chosen because the state does not pay support for adopted children, whereas in the case of foster care, child support ranging from 397 to 410 euros is paid per child per month, depending on the age of the child.
Pro Kind, je nach Alter.
In hindsight, and to an outside observer, it is almost inconceivable that this man claimed support. But it is a legal provision in Austria, and citizens are entitled to it.
Joseph Fritzl was not only above suspicion, he was actually getting financial help from the state. The fact was that nobody, neighbours or social services, thought there was anything wrong.
In the world upstairs, and everybody who knew them said so, everything seemed right. The children went to school, they did their homework properly, were brought up strictly by this father. And so after some time people would have said, this is an honourable man. He may be strict, but, as we say in Austria, a bit of strictness never hurt anybody. So all this certainly played a part.
In this very normal suburban town, Fritzl was able to create his extraordinary mirror image families. Decorations in the windows of the children's bedrooms upstairs were replicated in the dungeon bathroom below. By all accounts, he also made sure to celebrate birthdays and Christmases with both families. But the 2 worlds could not have been more different.
Wir wissen auch heute von den Ärzten, dass die im Gefängnis Gefangenen.
We know today from the doctors that those who are imprisoned do things at a totally different pace. The way they talk, the way they now choose to spend their time in freedom. It's simply impossible to imagine what it must have been like to establish a daily routine in this prison and to live with a constant reminder of the world outside. Watching television, seeing pictures, and hearing stories from their father about what life was like up there.
Von diesem Vater, wie das Leben denn oben stattfindet.
The Cellar children knew they had brothers and sisters living above them. Joseph even brought down videos so they could see for themselves another way of life. Elizabeth tried to give them a degree of normality. She taught them to read and write.
They had lessons, they learned grammar, they learned the language, they learned mathematics. So, I mean, they have been raised very well. They're very well behaved. It's really astounding if you experience Stefan. He's a very, very polite and educated person. And so I think Elizabeth tried her best to give them a structure and a good life under the given circumstances in the dungeon.
Recent pictures of Fritzl frolicking in Thailand suggest that he didn't have a care in the world. It's also suggested that he had a voracious sexual appetite.
Sein Sexualleben also mit Sicherheit nicht das Normale.
His sex life can definitely not be classified as normal. My information is that on numerous occasions he visited brothels where he indulged in various perverted activities.
Nachgegangen ist.
His absence on holiday for several weeks at a time has raised questions about whether he had an accomplice to look after his family. But police believe he was so well organised, it wouldn't have been necessary.
Die Situation in diesem Gefängnis zeigt sich nach der Spurensicherung als ein...
Based on evidence, we know this prison had a very restricted living area which was equipped with everything necessary to keep alive. for example. Large quantities of food in freezers and fridges. The facility to do laundry. There was a washing machine as well. And an electric cooking ring for preparing meals.
It needed detailed planning to maintain 2 families, one in total secrecy for 24 years. With 4 secret prisoners downstairs to clothe and feed, Fritzl used to drive out of Amstetten to do his shopping, ever careful not to arouse any suspicion locally with unusual purchases. The provisions were taken underground at night. And all the time his wife Rosemary was apparently oblivious to what her husband was doing. The disappearance of her daughter, the arrival of young babies on the doorstep, the absence of her husband for long periods of time. None of these seemed to have alerted her.
I don't understand why she didn't take the opportunity at some point, maybe while he was away on one of his 4-week holidays, to take action and say, "This is my child, and I want to know where my child is. Why did my child leave 1 baby or even 3 babies on my doorstep?" She didn't take action as a mother. I don't understand either the authorities or the mother.
Also ich verstehe Behörden diesbezüglich nicht und auch die Mutter nicht.
Rosemary, the loving grandmother, presented the picture of the perfect family.
So if Rosemary Fritzl hadn't kept the family together for so long, it might have turned out much earlier. But she tried to keep on the outside, playing the idyllic family with 3 lovely children and adopting them and being perfect grandparents and giving the love to them their mother couldn't give. So actually, unwittingly, she was an accomplice of her tyrant man. But who could blame her? Because, yeah, all she wanted to do actually is to give their grandchildren, who were apparently dumped in front of the doorstep, a nice childhood.
So far, the police say that Rosemary is not in a fit state to be questioned. She's now in a psychiatric hospital with her daughter and grandchildren. They're in therapy as a family.
Bis heute ist niemand als Tatverdächtiger ausgeschlossen. Es wurde immer ganz genau und dezidiert bemerkt.
Up till now, no one's been ruled out as a suspect. We've always categorically stated that our investigations have so far given us no reason to suspect anyone else. It may be hard to comprehend, but we must accept that a woman bringing up 7 children can't take care of everything, or pay the same amount of attention to her husband as she would if she had a smaller family.
DNA samples taken from the cellar indicate that no one else was present, apart from Joseph Fritzl.
Aber nunmehr gibt es nur einen einzigen Tatverdächtigen und man muss auch dazu sagen...
Up to now, we're only looking at a single suspect. And I have to add that there's a certain logic to the fact that this man didn't tell anyone else about his affairs. Because it was the only way, through secrecy and iron self-discipline, that he was able to keep it hidden from everyone for such an incredibly long time.
As police continue to build their case against him, Joseph Fritzl faces spending the rest of his life behind bars. For his victims, the future in freedom is far less certain. It's a shocking story that has attracted attention around the world. There were so many victims of Joseph Fritzl's house of horrors. His daughter Elizabeth, the 3 children incarcerated with her, Kirsten, Stefan and Felix, and the baby Michael who died, and Lisa, Monica and Alexander, snatched from their mother as babies to live a lie upstairs. The family is now reunited in a psychiatric hospital outside Amstetten. Together with the grandmother, they are starting the long process of recovery from their horrific past.
It is very amazing to watch the family because they behave like a normal family. I think there are lots of things which have been reported badly or wrongly. First, the children speak normal German. They communicate as anybody does. They walk as anybody does. And also what has been reported about Elizabeth. I mean, she's a normally looking woman, very attractive person. If you meet her and if you see her, the most important point right now is that she has the feeling that the kids are happy, that they feel comfortable, and that gives her, I would say, the best relief.
Since Elizabeth Fritzl was imprisoned 24 years ago, much has changed. But she retains a basic knowledge of the world.
Elizabeth
let's say, is led back out into a world that she once knew, in which she can remember, and which she has seen reflected on television. The others, the children, will be led out and will have to be taught how to live. And those senses that weren't stimulated downstairs will have to be stimulated. For example, rain makes a swishing sound. You can hear how the wind rustles the leaves in the trees. And when you go for a walk in the woods on a rainy day, the earth gives off a certain scent. So all sorts of completely new sensations hit you.
Sensationen, die völlig neu einströmen.
Some days ago it rained and Felix just said, I want to see for the first time rain because I never experienced that. And I mean, even if you hear that, you just realize, he didn't see that before. So I think he still has lots of things to experience.
But ordinary life is still not possible. The international interest in the case is such that the family cannot leave the hospital in which they are recovering. It's rumoured that the first photo of them is worth $1 million. Effectively, they are still in prison.
They cannot go outside because there are lots of paparazzi who want to take photographs. So this is something which gives them, again, the feeling of being captured. It's very difficult right now for Alex, Lisa and Monica, who lived together with the grandma upstairs. They cannot see their friends, they cannot meet their classmates, they even miss school. And this is something which is very hard for them. And they are just asking, when can they meet them again, when they can go to school again. And we all hope that this will happen pretty soon, because they have to have their normal life again.
The man responsible for all this sits in a real prison, 40 miles away. So far, Joseph Fritzl is reported to have shown little remorse.
When I met him again in his cell, I said, "It was you, Herr Fritzl? I'm appalled by you. How can anyone do such a thing?" To which he replied, "I'm very, very sorry for my family, but it cannot be undone." I replied, "You should have thought about that earlier."
Fritzl is said to be angered by the coverage of his own case. He dictated a statement to his lawyer denying being a monster. He says he was kind to his family. He could have killed them and didn't.
The media coverage is completely over the top. And so part of my job is to move it away from the monster back to the human being. Because it's a human being on trial and not a monster.
With Fritzl in prison, questions are now being asked about who else is to blame. In Amstetten, the local authorities have been accused of failings, accusations they strenuously deny.
Herr Fritzl ein Patriarch war, sehr autoritär.
Herr Fritzl was a patriarch, very authoritarian, so certain areas in his house were exclusively for his use. But why would this lead to suspicions there was a second family being kept down there? Who would get such an idea into their head? I ask you. Like the former tenants now talking, it's all too easy to be wise after the event.
There has been one admission of failure, the statute of limitations. Fritzl's conviction for rape was wiped from the record books after 10 years. Had it remained on his record, perhaps more questions would have been asked. The Austrian parliament is now changing the legislation. Austria is now in the midst of a period of soul-searching. First the Kampusch case, now this. 2 abductions, 2 secret cellars.
Wir ein Land sind, das besonders genau auf den Datenschutz achtet.
We're a country which is very particular about data protection. We tend to look the other way when a child gets a smack in the face, rather than be brave and intervene and say, "What on earth are you thinking? What are you doing?" We respect privacy so much that we don't pick up the phone and call the police to send someone over. Everyone is left to mind their own business. We have a saying in Austria, "Don't get involved."
Einen österreichischen Ausdruck, man mischt sich nicht hinein.
Fassungslosigkeit, Schock, Erstarrung, Lähmung und Stummheit.
The small town of Amstetten is struggling to deal with the fact that no one noticed. In the town square they are unfurling banners, a mark of respect for Elizabeth and her children for what they have suffered.
Mich informieren, Erklärungen suchen, Schuldige suchen, mich an Ausschauplätzen festkrallen.
It was this outpouring of public sentiment that triggered a response from the Fritzl family. On display in a shop window in Amstetten, outlines of their handprints and messages of hope for the future.
I like the sun and the fresh air.
I want to run across a meadow.
I want freedom and strength.
Abuser, father, grandfather. The public prosecutor has still to decide whether Joseph Fritzl is fit to stand trial later this year.
If you've been affected by issues similar to those in the programme, find out about support available at channel4.com/helplines.